Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the SERMAPod. SERMA is the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I am the founder and CEO and one of your hosts today for an incredible podcast on Title IX. We've got an all-star group of guests today, as well as some great people from SERMA. I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we're going to be talking again about Title IX, its significance today, around the 50th anniversary of this historic legislation. So first of all, we've got Jessica Mechtly. Jessica, I might have butchered that last name. I hope I didn't, even though you and I know each other now for a while. You've got one of those names that the more I think about it, the more I'm worried I'm going to screw it up.
Yeah, it's special. It's Mechtly.
Mechtly, I should know that.
It's all right.
Jessica is the Associate Director of Risk Management at the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and as I said, a member of the Advisory Board of SERMA. We've also got Taylor Weaver. Taylor is a law student at American University Washington College of Law and is our podcast intern responsible for helping get this great panel today. Taylor, welcome.
Thank you. Excited for this panel today.
We've also got Professor Barbara Osborne. Professor Barbara Osborne is the professor and law/sport administrator, dual degree coordinator at University of North Carolina. Prior to UNC, Professor Osborne worked for 14 years as an athletics administrator in college athletics. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
And finally, we've got Bekah Ansboro, who has as long a resume on her LinkedIn as anyone. Like Taylor, these are overachievers. Bekah was a 5-year starting pitcher for the George Mason University team. And Bekah, tell us more about what you've got going on now, which is, again, making me dizzy.
I just wrapped up my summer internship at Independent Sports and Entertainment. I was in their baseball department. I was their baseball intern. I had a great time working with the legal department and the agents at ISC, and now I am back to my regularly scheduled internship at the Major League Soccer Players Association as a law clerk. I've been there for a little over a year now. And once this school year gets going, I will also be a research assistant at the Global Antitrust Institute.
Excellent. All right. Welcome. So, Professor, why don't we start off by maybe giving our listeners and our viewers some context of why we're discussing Title IX, brief overview of what that is, why it's so significant, and as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of it, sort of the current state of that legislation.
Sure, I'm happy to.
All in 2 minutes or less. That's what we budgeted.
Right. So as you said, this is the 50th anniversary of Title IX, and Title IX was groundbreaking civil rights legislation. It was signed into law by President Nixon in 1972. And basically it prevents sex discrimination in all educational programs or activities at schools, public or private, that receive any kind of federal funding in any program that the school might offer. So if you think back to the 1960s, early 70s, we needed Title IX because women were not getting admitted into colleges or universities. Women with stellar credentials would get rejected by many, many schools, whereas any male that applied would be automatically admitted. And Congresswoman Patsy Mink from the University of Hawaii had experienced that both with medical schools and with law schools. And she, so when she ran for Congress, she decided that enough was enough and she needed to make that a mission. She was supported by Edith Green and Birch Bayh, and they managed to get the legislation through. When it was enacted, there was a lot of debate about whether or not Title IX would be applied to athletics. And senators from major public universities with huge football teams literally tried to get Title IX rescinded or an exemption from athletics. They failed. But there was an amendment called the Javits Amendment that required the U.S. Department of Education to create regulations specific to how Title IX should be implemented. And in that were regulations for athletics, which dramatically changed the opportunities for girls to participate in sports in the United States.
Thank you for that. We're going to get back to sort of where we are today with Title IX in a few minutes. But Taylor, why don't we turn to you for the next question?
Sure. I'll turn to you, Barbara. So you were a college track and field student athlete back when the AIAW championships were taken over by the NAIA.
Right. I can help you out here. Yeah. So I always say that I was a Title IX baby because my middle school actually had 0 competitive opportunities for girls. You could be a cheerleader, or you could be a spectator, but there were no athletic teams for girls in middle school or junior high. In high school, Title IX had been enacted, and so they had to add girls' teams when girls asked for them if they didn't have it. And fortunately for me, I was then able to go to college on a track scholarship. So I ran cross-country indoor and outdoor track. And I was in college at that unique intersection of time where, as a freshman, it was the AIAW, the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, that was the national governing body for women's sports. So I participated in their regional and national championships. Whereas then, in 1980, the NAIA, which is also a governing body for college athletics, much smaller than the NCAA, but they were the first to go co-ed and offer both male and female championships. I was fortunate to be on the cross-country team that won the first ever NAIA national championship. And then the NCAA came along, and within 2 years, the AIAW was basically put out of business because schools didn't have to pay extra dues to belong to the AIAW. They could just join their national governing body that they had already been in for their men's sports. So the NCAA basically took over for NCAA schools, and the NAIA still persists.
That's amazing. That's just so interesting to me. So I'm going to pivot a little bit. So Bekah, being a softball player myself, and I graduated way earlier than you. I'm getting old. In the early 2000s, we had the girls' softball field was separate from the boys when I was in high school, but the boys' baseball field was very upkept. It was beautiful. We had to hand paint our softball field. We had to maintain it. That's clearly a huge difference. I want to hear about your experience as far as your sport experience in softball.
Sure. In college, we did have to pull our own tarp when there was some bad weather, but we were fortunate in that we had a fantastic grounds crew. They kept our field up very nicely. So we never had any experiences such as that where we had to kind of put in more work for our field than the baseball team did. In high school, we were fortunate to have the nicer field. Our baseball field and our football field shared grass. So our baseball field's outfield was the football field, which was a little difficult. I am fortunate in that because I played much later, you didn't notice as many of these discrepancies between male sports and female sports. I think our coaches worked really hard to make sure that we were well represented to our athletic department. I know that they fought for us to make sure that we never noticed any differences, and we all appreciated it greatly. There were still some things that I think could have been better, but I think we can all agree that we've come so far since Title IX in 1972, but we still have a long way to go.
And on that topic, so this year being the 50th anniversary, where are we now, Barbara, would you say, numbers wise? Where does the gender gap stand, and how far have we come? How far do we have to go?
Well, we made tremendous leaps and bounds through the 1970s and early 80s. And then the country basically hit a recession. And there was also a Supreme Court decision related to Title IX that was not very favorable. And because of the recession, there were schools that actually cut women's programs then. Congress came back in, created the Civil Rights Restoration Act, restored Title IX the way they had intended it to be used instead of the way the Supreme Court had interpreted it. And we have seen continued growth since. The problem is that men's programs have still continued to grow at a rate that's higher than women's programs. So women are making gains and have been making gains. It's just that the women's gains are slower since the 1980s than men's gains have been. And that's despite colleges and universities choosing to cancel many men's programs. Basically, when they do that, oftentimes they'll say it's because of Title IX, but really what we've found in our research is that it really doesn't help the schools come into Title IX compliance, and they put all of their resources from those canceled men's sports into their favorite men's sport, which is football.
So to that point, if I could just jump in, Professor, I mean, a lot of this, let's face it, is driven by revenue, right? I mean, this is big business. It's billions of dollars being transacted in college athletics. So you can't talk about the progress in Title IX without addressing what you just said, that these schools are highly motivated by the industry that surrounds college athletics. And, you're running into the problem of wanting to continue the goals of Title IX versus the reality of what, as you said, a lot of the college programs are doing, which is not distributing the money, it's putting it into the high revenue generating sports.
Well, that is like the biggest lie that persists in college athletics, because very, very few football teams, only the very top football teams in the FBS schools, in the Power 5 conferences, actually make money. And so that myth that football pays for everything else is truly just a myth. Football is an incredibly expensive sport. It does bring in a tremendous amount of revenue, but at the majority of schools, it doesn't even pay for itself. And a lot of the schools that have cut teams, as you can imagine, the schools that are making money from football aren't cutting teams. It's the schools that keep putting more and more money into football with the chance that they could become good, that are the ones that are sacrificing other men's sports in order to fund, put more money into football. It's the classic example of what my mom always calls is throwing good money after bad, or throwing good money after bad. Sorry about that. So the mandate under Title IX is that athletics is an educational experience that extends that educational opportunity. And the things that you learn by being a college athlete are not things that you necessarily learn in the classroom. And because those qualities and skills are things that help you throughout your life, and because employers actually value those things, they will hire former student athletes above others with similar credentials. It's important for both male and female athletes to have the same opportunities so that they can both contribute equally based on the experiences that they have once they've graduated from school. So, the funding thing, I always explain it sort of as if you look at a family and your family budget, right? You want to provide as much as you can for all of your kids. And you don't generally tell one kid, well, no, you can't do that because we're putting all of our money into this one's extracurricular activities. And that's what schools need to be doing as well. They need to be focusing on how to create equal opportunities, whatever those opportunities may be, instead of basically believing the myth or, again, throwing bad money or throwing good money into a bad or a lost cause.
And Barbara, going back to the requirement of equal scholarships, what was the scholarship allocation like when you were in college? And then I'd turn to Rebekah to see what your opportunities were and see the difference.
Okay, so Title IX's scholarships requirement actually was written to be very pragmatic because there were so few female athletes in college at the time. The scholarships requirement basically allows you to give scholarships as a percentage, representing the percentage of male to female athletes. So if at that time, say 95% of your athletes were male and 5% were female, you only had to give 5% of your scholarships to women. Now, at the typical college or university now, the average large public university and the average liberal arts college are about 60% female versus 40% male, but their athletics departments are still 60% male and 40% female. So from the scholarships perspective, you can still give 60% of the scholarships to men and 40% to women, but you're not then in compliance with the participation opportunities aspect of Title IX. So there's a dissonance within Title IX.
Rebekah, how about you? Did you receive a scholarship when you were playing in college, and how did that affect your college experience?
Yes, I was fortunate. I was on scholarship all 5 years that I played at George Mason. I do know that one way that we as a program made some strides is, I believe when I came in, we only had 5 scholarships allocated to our program, and by the time we left, I think we had 7 or 8, which is still not fully funded. And on the topic of scholarships, this is a little bit outside of the purview of Title IX, though not entirely. The discussion around NIL and paying athletes can be very frustrating at times because a lot of people argue, well, they're getting paid in a scholarship. Why do they need to get paid? Why do they need extra money? And it's just not true. Division III athletes don't get athletic scholarships at all. A lot of Division I and Division II athletes are not on scholarship. And even programs that are fully funded often don't have enough scholarships for their entire team. I know that baseball receives a fully funded college baseball program. I think it's 11.7 scholarships. I don't know why it's that number. But baseball teams have 40 guys on the team. I think softball fully funded is 12 or 13. We have 20 to 30 on a team. So that's a very frustrating conversation, and I think people don't realize that just because you're on the team doesn't mean that you get college paid for.
I know Jessica's got a question. I just wanted to jump in because it's something I'm curious, listening to both of you speak as student athletes, Professor and Bekah. How much of these issues are actually overt and being discussed? I imagine these days, especially with the attention being paid to the anniversary of Title IX, Bekah, and of course being a little bit more aware as a culture, in your experience as a student athlete, you're probably discussing these issues, thankfully, a little bit more on the surface. Also, George Mason, over the last few years, has had a tremendous run in athletics. They had a great, run in the NCAA as the men's basketball team did. So I imagine some of these issues, again, thankfully, are being talked about a little more than perhaps, Professor, when you were a student athlete. They were probably still not as discussed as much as they are now, thankfully, because of people like you. We're discussing these issues a lot more. That's a really long-winded question, but maybe, Bekah, you could help me out by answering what I'm struggling to ask.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up. I would imagine that it is discussed much more now than when Barbara was a student athlete, but I think this is one of the areas that athletic departments could really improve. I admittedly can be a little bit of a big personality, but I did get into it with one of the male athletes one time because it was obvious that not his fault, but he just didn't understand how athletic departments worked. He started going, it was a basketball player, which George Mason doesn't have football, so men's basketball is kind of our quote unquote revenue sport. And he was convinced that the basketball program funded the entire athletic department. And I had to explain to him, no, it probably doesn't even fund your program. And it was not his fault. I just think no one had ever told him this before. So I would love if, every athletic department has beginning of the year orientation where you have to go over your compliance paperwork, how drug tests work and not to do drugs, what different academic resources are available to you. I would love if there was a Title IX session in there as well, because I think a lot of times it's just assumed that the female athletes will know how Title IX works, and that's never a task that's put onto the male athletes. And it would be helpful if the entire athletic department, student athletes, admin, and otherwise were more well-versed on Title IX instead of just kind of going off of things that they might hear.
Professor, I imagine there's a similar story at UNC, which is obviously one of the most elite men's basketball programs in the country, and a very prominent football program as well. But what are your thoughts on sort of how we've evolved on campus discussing these issues?
So you're absolutely right in that when I was a student athlete, nobody mentioned Title IX. I was honestly completely unaware of Title IX until I took a sport law class when I was in college. That's the first time that I had ever heard about it. So even though the legislation had been enacted and I had been a beneficiary of it, I was completely unaware that it even existed. And sadly, the overwhelming majority of people in the United States might recognize Title IX, and they think of it as maybe that law that lets girls play, which is fun wording. But they don't really they really don't know what it does. And male athletes often just completely ignore it because they think that it doesn't apply to them in that sense. But the really, really sad research that exposed lack of Title IX knowledge has been on college athletics coaches and administrators, that less than 75% would, in research that was done fairly recently, would have actually passed a basic Title IX kind of quiz. And so I am totally on board with the need for mandatory education for Title IX within athletics departments. But I think it needs to be administrators, it needs to be all the coaches, and it needs to be all the student athletes. Because student athletes can't ask for equal treatment if they don't know what it is that they're allowed to ask for. Coaches oftentimes do not ask for equity. A lot of women's coaches don't know exactly what they would be able to ask for, but they're also in fear of retaliation, and they don't know that Title IX protects against that. And then administrators, I kind of always laugh that the NCAA, there's a ton of NCAA rules that actually makes it very difficult for schools to if they're complying with the NCAA rules, it makes it harder for them sometimes to actually comply with Title IX rules. And the NCAA requires every coach that does recruiting to have to pass a recruiting exam to show that they know the recruiting rules before they go out to recruit. And that's just NCAA rules. Why can't they have a mandatory program that educates and requires them to pass a Title IX test so that they comply with federal law in order for them to work in an educational institution that is supposed to be complying with it? I would venture right now, again, 75% of college athletic administrators really have a very unclear understanding of what Title IX is. And there may not be a lot of intentional discrimination going on, but in my past experiences and in my current experiences in doing Title IX audits and consulting, there is probably not a single athletics program in the country that's actually in compliance, despite some of the best intentions, because they really just don't know what it is and what it requires.
That's a mind-blowing takeaway, right? I mean, I just think about what the professor said, that there's not a single program in the country that is compliant with Title IX as we talk about this 50 years later. That's amazing. Amazing in a terrible way, of course. Jessica.
Yep. To segue into that, as a young athlete, my mother, who played baseball with the boys because she did not have a program to play in. And as my first softball coach, she hammered it into our heads, Title IX, Title IX. And you would get a bunch of my teammates roll their eyes. Oh my gosh, her mom again. But I'm actually very grateful that she did that, because then when it came to high school and then when college recruiters came, we had some knowledge there. Now, Rebecca, you would have been a hero of my mom's, because it looks like as a softball student athlete, you wore the number 72 to honor Title IX. And to what, the professor just said, there's such a lack of knowledge around this, about how many people know not much or anything at all about Title IX. What do you think about the lack of awareness around Title IX? How we can work to educate and empower the next generation of advocates, not just on the coach and administration level, but on the player level?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like our moms would have gotten along great. My mom is self-described athletically challenged, but she fought really hard for me to make sure that I had the best athletic experience that I could. I wholeheartily agree with what you said, Jessica, with what you said, Barbara. People just don't know anything about Title IX. I mean, it first and foremost, we said at the top of this podcast, it's an education law, and everyone assumes it's just like, oh, it's so girls can play sports, and they assume that means it has to be 50-50, which we know is not the case. Your athletic department has to be reflective of your student body. So if your student body is 70% male, 30% female, then your athletic department, student athlete wise, has to reflect the same. 70% male, 30% female. Everyone thinks it's 50-50, completely split. Most people just don't have a grasp of what Title IX protects, as Barbara outlined earlier. And, I think the younger student athletes, maybe they don't quite have as much of an interest, or maybe it's just that they don't understand it, so they don't feel interested in it. But it was just always very interesting to hear what, my teammates and athletes on other teams thought Title IX was, and, getting to explain to them, no, that's not the case. This is what it protects. No, your program doesn't fully fund the entire athletic department. It was always very interesting to see it kind of click in their minds. And I hope that by wearing number 72 as my jersey number, I was able to get a couple of my teammates a little more on board. I know that we, in my first few years, experienced a lot of adversity, and I hope that experience, and then just having a better understanding of what Title IX is, helps them in the future be able to share that with others, because, we can't repeat it enough. I think everyone needs to know a little bit more about Title IX. I love Barbara's idea of requiring coaches and administrators pass some sort of an exam to have a better understanding of it.
Listening to everyone, I'm we're focused on college athletics, of course, but bigger picture, I think there's been strides made in women's athletics across the board, right? We're just seeing the end of the career of Serena Williams, one of the greatest athletes, period, in any sport in history. We know about the women's success of the women's soccer team in pay equity, right? They got a $24 million settlement from the U.S. Soccer Federation. I'm watching the WNBA playoffs going on right now. These are things, Professor, that weren't happening at the beginning of Title IX, and I assume that you can attribute some of the success in professional sports to the progress made through Title IX.
Absolutely, because if we didn't have Title IX, I have no idea how much longer it would have taken for girls to be able to have opportunities, because they had to have opportunities in school-based programs. That then opened up opportunities in community programs, recreation programs, club sport programs, and because demand was there for it. And without Title IX, I think it would have just taken us so much longer. And even when I say that we are still not there yet, I hate to think of where we would be if that legislation was never passed.
Yeah, and Bekah, who are your heroes? I mean, some of the names I mentioned, they're heroes to all of us, right? I mean, if you love sports, you cannot not love Serena Williams, right? I mean, you can't deny that. Who are some of your female heroes that led you to your success in college athletics?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like you said, Serena Williams is one of the best athletes, period. Simone Biles is the same way. I think it's comical when people talk about the greatest athlete of all time, and frequently you hear Michael Jordan and Tom Brady, and not to take anything away from them. I love that more often now we're hearing Serena and Simone in the conversation. I was fortunate when I was about 13, 14, I met Dot Richardson, who is now the head softball coach at Liberty University. She was a pioneer of Title IX. I believe she's still at Liberty, but I met her at a college tournament that my parents and I had gone to watch, and she was fantastic. And it was nice to get to thank her for helping to lay the groundwork, lay the foundation for all the girls that came after her, including myself. I really look up to, we've had an influx of women coaching in minor league baseball. Baseball is kind of my sport of focus. That's my favorite sport to watch and stay up on. And so it's been great seeing more women in on-field capacities. Of course, it's great seeing them in the front office. We have Kim Eng, the new GM of the Miami Marlins. It's very encouraging. I know that at my internship this summer at ISE, when I met everyone, someone had said, "Oh, it's great to have a woman in the legal department." I was like, "Yeah, you know what? It is great." At my internship at MLSPA, there are so many women in the office, so it's very encouraging. I know that one of the big taglines is, "If you can see her, you can be her," and I think I took that for granted when I was younger. And as I am older, as I've gotten older, I've seen that is true. It's nice to see women in these positions and realize that it is attainable, especially, going into the last year of law school, trying to enter the job market soon. It's like, great, that is something I can do. That is an option for me.
Well, thank you, Barbara, Bekah, and Jessica, so much for sharing your experiences today. This has been so educational and insightful for me, and I'm sure it will be for many others. So just to kind of wrap up everything we've talked about, going forward over the next 50 years, what would need to happen to really fulfill that true purpose and promise of Title IX?
Well, so much will need to happen. I'm not actually very optimistic about that right now, because we seem to be going backwards as a society and a culture in appropriate roles for women and women's rights. And the role of women in athletics has reflected the opportunities overall in our culture as well. Athletics leads sometimes, it follows sometimes, and sometimes it mirrors. And one of the things that's great about Title IX is that those athletics opportunities have created the opportunities for women in the boardrooms and women in leadership positions across, the U.S. And so, we need education. We need more funding in women's sports. We need television and promotion of women's sports and women's athletes. And we also need to build a culture that actually equally values men and women. And until we get there, I don't see us actually being able to achieve it within the athletics realm.
Bekah, last word on the same subject.
Yeah, endorse everything that Barbara just said. We've said it a couple of times today, but we just really need more education on the topic. I studied sport management, so, I got plenty of it in the classroom, but not everyone in college athletics studies sports management. So I agree that we're going to need a lot more education, both for the athletes and those in higher roles, since they're the ones making the decisions. In more ways than one, I think the NCAA could revamp a couple of their policies. But I'll remain a little more optimistic and hope that we are able to get there. I think that even though sports are not for everyone, they are very reflective of society. I think sports and society mirror each other in a lot of ways. So I'm hopeful that in both college and professional athletics we'll be able to make that progress toward equality.
Big thanks to Professor Barbara Osborne from University of North Carolina and Bekah Ansboro, who will soon be running her own professional sports team somewhere, no doubt. We'll be looking to maybe hire me and some others. Remember this podcast. For Jessica and Taylor, and of course Matt Liller behind the scenes, our producer, we want to thank you for a very robust and interesting discussion, and we'll see you next time on the SERMAPod.
Ideas, strategies, and opinions represented on this podcast are those of the speakers and do not represent the ideas, strategies, and opinions of their employers.